In 1827, a Troy housewife named Hannah Lord Montague noticed something simple. Her husband wore his shirt more than once, but the collar got dirty every day. She cut the collar off, washed it, and sewed it back on. That small act of domestic ingenuity, one woman solving a laundry problem, became a multi-million-dollar industry that defined an entire city for over a century. At its peak, Troy, New York produced 90% of all the detachable collars and cuffs worn by American men. 8,000 workers, almost all women, almost all Irish immigrants, sewed, starched, and ironed the collars that defined what a respectable man looked like in the Gilded Age. The company at the center of it all was Cluett, Peabody and Company. Their brand was Arrow. Their product, eventually, was the most popular dress shirt in America. In 1955, they sold $87 million worth of Arrow shirts in a single year. Then the jobs went south. Then they went overseas. Then the factory went silent. Then the buildings came down. Today, where thousands of Irish immigrant women once stood 12 hours a day at ironing tables in 100-degree heat, there is a parking lot, and a government building, and a brewery that displays antique collars as curiosities behind glass. This is the story of Arrow shirts, the company that dressed American men for a century, the women who built it with their hands, and the city they left behind. The detachable collar was born not in a factory or a boardroom, but in a kitchen from frustration. Hannah Lord Montague was married to Orlando Montague, a blacksmith in Troy, New York. Troy in 1827 was a prosperous, growing city. Located at the confluence of the Hudson and Mohawk rivers, it was a natural gateway between the port of New York City and the expanding interior of the continent. Men worked in iron foundries, steel mills, and warehouses. They wore white shirts to work. They sweated. The shirts got dirty. The problem Hannah Montague solved was specific. Her husband's shirt could be worn more than once, but the collar was soiled by a single day's wear. Laundering the entire shirt every day was an enormous amount of work. She looked at the collar. She picked up her scissors. She cut it off. She finished the raw edge with a buttonhole. She washed the collar alone, starched it, ironed it, and reattached it. The collar could now be washed separately. The shirt could be worn again. It seems obvious in retrospect. It was revolutionary at the time. The news of this small innovation spread through Troy's neighborhoods with remarkable speed. A retired minister named Ebenezer Brown saw the commercial potential immediately. He put his wife and daughter to work making detachable collars, which he called string collars, and sold them from his dry goods store. By the 1840s, dozens of small collar-making operations had opened throughout Troy. By the 1850s, there were factories. By the 1860s, Troy was producing millions of collars every year, and the city had earned the nickname it still carries today, the Collar City. The collar industry pulled immigrant workers into Troy the way steel pulled them to Pittsburgh. Men worked the iron foundries and steel mills in the southern part of the city. Women, overwhelmingly Irish women, who had come to America during the famine years of the 1840s and 1850s, found work in the collar factories and laundries. By the 1880s, over 8,000 workers were employed in Troy's collar and cuff industry. They were making 90% of every collar worn by every American man. The idea that had come from one woman cutting fabric at a kitchen table had become the foundation of an entire city's economy. The collar industry ran on women's labor. The cutting rooms, the sewing floors, the finishing rooms, all women. And the laundries, which washed and starched and pressed the finished collars before they were shipped, all women. The laundry work was the worst. Laundresses worked 12 to 14 hours a day, standing at ironing tables and washtubs set beside furnaces. The heat in summer was staggering, 100 degrees or more in the laundry rooms, with no ventilation, no breaks, no accommodation for the human beings doing the work. They washed the collars in boiling water by hand, bleached them with chloride of soda, rinsed and rolled them, starched them, and then ironed them with cast iron irons weighing up to 10 pounds, heated by burning coals inside the iron itself. The wages were $2 or $3 a week. If a laundress burned a collar, the cost came out of her pay. If she dropped one on the floor, she was fined. When the commercial laundries installed new mechanized starching machines in the early 1860s, machines that ran collars through a scalding starch bath faster than human hands could manage, the women working at the receiving end of those machines were expected to keep up, and many of them were scalded when they couldn't. Severe burns were common. Serious injuries were frequent. Fatalities were not unusual. In February 1864, a 19-year-old laundress named Kate Mullany had had enough. Mullany was the daughter of Irish immigrants who had come to Troy as refugees from the famine. Her father had died. Her mother was in poor health. Kate was the family's breadwinner, supporting her mother, her sister, and 3 younger siblings on $2 or $3 a week earned at a collar laundry. She had been asking her employer for higher wages. She had been ignored. Mullany had been listening to her neighbors, men who worked in Troy's iron foundries, talk about the power of collective action. The Iron Molders Union had won better wages and conditions through organized strikes. She saw no reason why the collar laundresses couldn't do the same. On February 4, 1864, Kate Mullany and her coworker Esther Keegan organized approximately 300 women into the Collar Laundry Union, the first sustained women's labor union in American history. 2 weeks later, 300 women from 14 Troy laundries went on strike. They demanded a 20 to 25% wage increase and improved working conditions. The owners refused. The women stayed out. By the end of February, every laundry owner in Troy had capitulated. Kate Mullany won. She bought a double-row house on 8th Street with her earnings, a statement in brick and mortar that an Irish immigrant laundress could own something permanent in the country that had given her family refuge from starvation. Her house is now a National Historic Site. The laundry owners spent the next decades trying to break what she built. In 1886, more than 8,000 laundry and shirt workers struck under the leadership of the Collar Starch's Joan of Arc Assembly of the Knights of Labor. In 1905, the owners finally crushed the union after a long and bitter strike. By then, the industry had already begun to change in ways that would eventually make the question of organizing Troy's laundresses irrelevant. The story of Cluett, Peabody and Company begins in 1851, when a small business called Mullen and Blanchard opened at 282 River Street in Troy to manufacture detachable collars. Over the next 50 years, through a series of partnerships, mergers, name changes, and consolidations, this modest operation grew into the dominant force in American collar manufacturing. The final form, Cluett, Peabody and Company, was established in 1899. By 1912, the New York Times reported that Cluett, Peabody and Company was the largest manufacturers of collars, shirts, and cuffs in the world, and was about to become even larger. Their combined annual output from factories in Troy, Rochester, Corinth, Waterford, Leominster, South Norwalk, and Quebec was 7 million dozen collars and 500,000 dozen shirts per year. The well-dressed American man of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era changed his collar several times a day. The very wealthy might change it 5 or 6 times, a different style for morning calls, for office work, for afternoon visits, for dinner, for the opera. Every one of those collars, in every one of those styles, in every one of the hundreds of neck sizes available, had to be made, finished, starched, and pressed by the women of Troy. The factory on River Street was, for a time, the largest shirt and collar factory in the world. It sprawled along the Hudson River in a series of brick buildings, connected by covered walkways, covering blocks of downtown Troy. The entire visible architecture of that part of the city was Cluett, Peabody. The Arrow brand had been introduced in 1885. It was the label that would eventually define everything the company made. But in 1885, Arrow was simply one collar brand among many, distinguished primarily by its quality, which was genuine, and its variety, which was extraordinary. 400 different styles. Every neck size. Every occasion. Every fashion season. What Arrow needed, by 1905, was a face. In 1905, Cluett, Peabody hired a commercial artist named Joseph Christian Leyendecker to create a new advertising campaign for the Arrow brand. Leyendecker was already the most sought-after commercial illustrator in America. Born in Germany, trained at the Art Institute of Chicago and in Paris, he had created cover art for Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post, the 2 most widely read magazines in the country. He understood, better than anyone in advertising, how a single image could make a man want something he hadn't known he wanted. The model for the Arrow collar man was Charles Beach, a Canadian who was also Leyendecker's lifelong romantic partner. No known photographs of Beach survive, but his likeness, the strong jaw, the dimpled chin, the slightly melancholic gaze that never quite focused on the viewer, lives on in the hundreds of illustrations Leyendecker produced for Arrow between 1905 and 1931. The campaign was called, by marketing historians, the first true brand advertising campaign in American history. Before the arrow collar man, advertisements sold products. Leyendecker and Cluett, Peabody sold an image, the promise of what a man could be if he wore the right collar. The results were unprecedented. In 1 month in the early 1920s, the arrow collar man received 17,000 fan letters, more than any male film star of the era. Women sent gifts. Marriage proposals arrived by the bundle. A Broadway musical called Helen of Troy was inspired by the character. Fitzgerald and Hemingway wrote about men who looked like Leyendecker's arrow figures. The fictional creation had escaped the page and become a cultural ideal. Leyendecker's illustrations drove Cluett, Peabody's sales to $32 million annually, staggering numbers for the era. But the arrow collar man's time was ending even as his fan mail peaked. The soldiers who came back from World War I had spent years wearing shirts with attached collars, practical, comfortable, easy to maintain in field conditions. They had learned, in the mud of France, that the stiff detachable collar was an affectation they could live without. The men who returned from the war in 1918 and 1919 had no interest in putting their necks back into starched prison. Detachable collar sales collapsed. The factory that had produced 7 million dozen collars per year found itself suddenly making something nobody wanted. In 1919, a man named Sanford Cluett joined Cluett, Peabody and Company. He was a member of the founding family, the grandson of George B. Cluett, who had made the original company, and he was an engineer with a mind for problems. The problem in 1919 was that cotton shirts shrank when washed. Every man who bought a cotton dress shirt knew the frustration. A shirt that fit perfectly in the store emerged from the laundry a size too small. The shrinkage could run as high as 10%. It made buying a shirt a guessing game and wearing it a disappointment. Sanford Cluett spent 11 years on the problem. The solution he arrived at was mechanical rather than chemical. Cotton cloth stretches during weaving and finishing. It's under tension throughout the manufacturing process. When that tension is released by washing, the cloth contracts back toward its original state. Shrinkage. Cluett's process, which he named Sanforization after himself, mechanically compressed the fabric before it was cut into shirts. A machine pressed the cloth, reducing it to its natural relaxed state. A shirt made from sanforized fabric would not shrink when washed, because it had already been shrunk before it was made. The patent was filed in 1930. The impact was immediate and total. For the first time in the history of clothing, a man could buy a shirt and know it would fit after washing. The sanforized label became a guarantee that every American shirt buyer understood. Within a few years, Sanforization was being licensed to shirt manufacturers across the country, and then around the world. By mid-century, virtually every cotton garment made in the United States bore the Sanforized mark. The royalties from Sanforization licensing became, for decades, the single largest source of profit for Cluett, Peabody and Company, larger than the shirts themselves. The company that had survived the collapse of the detachable collar business had invented something that everyone in the textile industry needed. The pivot from collars to shirts had been completed. In 1929, Cluett, Peabody established a national menswear business under the Arrow brand name. The Arrow product line expanded to include shirts, handkerchiefs, ties, cravats, pajamas, and underwear for men and boys. By 1935, the company operated 11 factories, mostly in the Northeast. By 1945, sales had reached $31 million. By 1955, they had nearly tripled, $87 million, from the company that had started making collars in Troy in 1851. The women of Troy were still sewing. But what they were sewing had changed completely. The 1950s were the golden age of the American dress shirt. The post-war economic boom had created a massive new class of office workers. Men who wore button-down collars to work 5 days a week, who needed multiple shirts in multiple colors, who associated a well-pressed Arrow shirt with success, with respectability, with arrival. Arrow understood this market completely. The advertising was sophisticated, the quality was genuine, and the Sanforized guarantee had made the brand synonymous with reliability. In a decade when every American man wore a dress shirt to work, Arrow was the dominant name in the category. At peak production, the Troy factory and its network of plants were producing 67,700 dozen garments every week. Every week. That is more than 800,000 individual shirts and other garments, sewn, cut, finished, pressed, packaged, and shipped from buildings along the Hudson River in Troy, New York. The factory was a small city. Cafeterias served thousands of meals. The payroll supported not just the workers themselves, but their families, their landlords, their corner stores, their bars, their churches. A third of Troy's economy ran through Cluett, Peabody. The women who worked in the factory in the 1950s were the granddaughters and great-granddaughters of the Irish immigrant women who had built the collar industry in the 1860s. Troy's Irish-American community had grown up around this work. The factory was embedded in the neighborhood the way a steel mill was embedded in Pittsburgh or a car factory in Detroit. Inseparable from the community, from the identity, from the way the city understood itself. Multi-generational employment was the norm. Women brought their daughters to work. Mothers trained daughters on the same machines where they had spent their own working lives. The skills, the precise movements of the sewing machine operator, the quality control instincts of the finishing room inspector, the speed and accuracy of the cutting room worker, were passed down like any craft, through demonstration and repetition and the quiet pride of mastery. In 1955, Arrow shirts were selling at a rate that made Cluett, Peabody the largest brand-name shirt manufacturer in the United States. The company that had nearly collapsed when the detachable collar fell out of fashion had reinvented itself completely. The Sanforization patent was generating royalties from hundreds of licensees. The Arrow brand was a fixture in every American department store. The future looked secure. The factory would keep running. The women would keep sewing. The shirts would keep selling. None of that would prove to be true. The first cracks appeared in the 1960s, and they came from two directions simultaneously. The first was domestic competition from the American South. Southern states, eager for industrial development, were offering manufacturers tax incentives, lower wages, and new factory buildings to relocate from the unionized Northeast. Textile manufacturers across New England and New York began closing their old facilities and reopening in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee, where wages were lower, unions were weaker, and government officials were actively courting the business. Cluett, Peabody began the process that would eventually hollow out the Troy factory. Not all at once, but section by section, year by year. Cutting rooms closed. Production lines were consolidated. Workers who left were not replaced. The factory that had employed thousands was shrinking by degrees, each reduction too small to make headlines, but adding up, year by year, to a fundamental transformation. The second crack was international. By the mid-1970s, Cluett, Peabody had arranged contract production from Korean manufacturers. An additional 31,000 dozen shirts per week produced overseas and sold under the Arrow brand. These weren't counterfeit shirts. They were genuine Arrow shirts, made to Arrow specifications by Korean workers earning a fraction of what American workers earned. The shirts were identical. The economics were decisive. Once a shirt manufacturer begins importing from low-wage countries, the logic is irreversible. The workers in Troy were sewing the same shirts as the workers in Korea. The shirts were the same. The wages were completely different. Every quarter, the arithmetic became a little clearer and a little harder to ignore. Troy in the 1970s was already feeling the erosion. The collar industry had defined the city for over a century. As the factories downsized and some closed entirely, the economic ripple effects spread through every neighborhood. The corner stores that had served the factory workers had fewer customers. The bars where workers unwound after their shifts were quieter. The churches that the Irish-American collar workers had built in the 19th century were aging, and their congregations were smaller, and the children of the congregation were leaving Troy for places with more economic future. The city was not dying, but it was contracting, and the contraction was accelerating. In 1985, Cluett, Peabody and Company was acquired by West Point Pepperell, a Georgia-based textile company. The acquisition had been preceded by a hostile takeover bid from investor Paul Bilzerian, which the company's board had rejected. Then they accepted West Point Pepperell's offer instead. It was the end of Cluett, Peabody as an independent company. The Troy operation, already reduced from its peak, began the process of being integrated into a larger corporate structure that had no particular attachment to the Hudson Valley or the city that had built the shirt business in the first place. The last Cluett, Peabody offices moved out of Troy in 1989, 138 years after Mullen and Blanchard had opened at 282 River Street to make collars. The company that had grown from that small operation packed up and left the city it had defined. The factory complex on River Street, which had at its peak stretched for blocks along the Hudson, was torn down. Almost all of it. What the demolition crews didn't take was left to decay. The blocks-long plant that had been the centerpiece of downtown Troy for generations became parking lots and weeds. One building survived. The 1916 reinforced concrete factory building at 433 River Street, considered an advanced structure for its time when it was built, was eventually converted to offices and is now known as Headley Park Place. Troy City Hall is located there. The building where shirts were made now houses the municipal government of the city those shirts built. The Arrow brand itself continued, passed from owner to owner in a succession of corporate transactions that stripped it further from its roots with each transfer. West Point Pepperell to Biderman Industries in 1990. Biderman to Cluett American Group in 1998. Cluett American Group to Phillips Van Heusen, the parent company of Van Heusen, Arrow's longtime competitor, in 2004 for approximately $70 million. Phillips Van Heusen to Authentic Brands Group in 2021. Today the Arrow brand is owned by a holding company and primarily sold on Amazon. The shirts no longer have anything to do with Troy. They have not been made in America in decades. The women who built the brand, who sewed the shirts, who stood 12 hours a day at cutting tables and sewing machines so that American men could look respectable, they are statistics now. Old photographs. Names on census records. Walk along River Street in Troy today, and you can see what remains. Some of the factory buildings have been converted to apartments and offices. One is a brewery, where vintage collars are displayed behind glass as decorative artifacts. The Hart Cluett Museum preserves photographs of the collar workers, samples of the products, records of the company. The Kate Mullany House on 8th Street is a National Historic Site, maintained by the National Park Service in honor of the woman who organized the first women's labor union in American history. But the industry itself is gone. The 8,000 workers who made Troy's collar factories hum in the 1880s. The thousands who sewed Arrow shirts in the 1950s. The production that made Troy one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States in the 19th century. All of it gone by degrees over the long slide from the 1960s through the 1980s. Troy never fully recovered. Its population peaked in the early 20th century and has declined with intermittent pauses ever since. The collar industry's departure created a hole in the city's economic fabric that has never been fully filled. New employers have come, a medical center, state government offices, a growing arts community. But the scale of what was lost has never been replaced. The women who built this industry are, for the most part, invisible in the historical record. The executives of Cluett, Peabody have portraits in the Hart Cluett Museum. The Arrow Collar Man has his own Wikipedia page. J.C. Leyendecker has been the subject of retrospectives and scholarly attention. Hannah Lord Montague has a historical marker near the site of her house. But the 8,000 women who stood at ironing tables in 100-degree heat, who organized the first women's union in America, who sewed and starched and pressed the collars that made the industry possible. They exist primarily as statistics and occasional photographs. The laundresses whose labor made someone else rich. The factory workers whose skills made someone else's brand famous. The shirts survive better than the stories. A well-made 1950s Arrow shirt, if it has been stored carefully, still fits perfectly. The Sanforized fabric doesn't shrink. The stitching doesn't unravel. The buttonholes are still precise. The quality is still there, in every seam, from the hands of women who learned the work from their mothers, who learned it from their mothers in a city on the Hudson River. What does the Arrow shirt story teach us? The easy lesson is about globalization, about what happens when the logic of lower labor costs overrides every other consideration, including the communities that built the industry in the first place. But the story of Cluett, Peabody is older and more complicated than that. It begins in 1827 with a woman solving a domestic problem. It passes through the Irish immigrant women who built the collar industry with their hands. It runs through Kate Mullany and the first women's union. It reaches its peak with a fictional man in a magazine advertisement and an engineer who solved the shrinkage problem. And it ends with a brand name on an Amazon listing. The Arrow Collar Man was one of the most successful advertising campaigns in American history. He received more fan mail than any film star of his era. He inspired a Broadway musical and appeared in the novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald. He sold millions of collars and then millions of shirts. He was fictional. The women who made the collars and shirts were real. They worked 12-hour days in 100-degree heat for $2 a week. They organized America's first women's union. They built a city. They were replaced gradually and without fanfare by workers in Korea and then workers in other places where the wages were even lower. The gap between the image and the reality is the whole story of American manufacturing in the 20th century. The image was aspirational, the arrow collar man, impossibly handsome, perfectly groomed, staring out from a million magazine pages. The reality was industrial. Thousands of women in a factory on the Hudson River, doing difficult and dangerous work for wages that were always too small and fighting when they had the courage and the leadership for something better. The image survived. The Arrow brand still exists, as a name on a website. The reality, the factory, the workers, the community, is gone. Troy is still called the Collar City. The nickname is still on the city's tourism materials, still on the signs at the city limits, still in the local newspapers when anyone writes about the city's history. But the collar industry ended decades ago. The factories are gone. The workers are gone. The name outlasted everything it was built on. If you go to Troy today, you can find antique collars in a few shops and museums. You can find Kate Mullany's house, carefully maintained by the Park Service. You can find the one surviving Cluett, Peabody factory building, now housing the city government. You can find, in the Hart Cluett Museum, the photographs of the women who did the work. What you cannot find is the work itself. The sewing machines are silent. The cutting rooms are apartments. The laundry furnaces are cold. The steam that rose from the ironing tables has long since dissipated into the Hudson Valley air. A housewife cut a collar off a shirt in 1827 and started an industry. Irish immigrant women sewed and starched that industry into existence with their hands. Kate Mullany organized the first women's union in American history. An artist named Leyendecker created a fictional man so compelling he received 17,000 love letters in a single month. An engineer named Sanford Cluett solved the shrinkage problem and licensed the solution to the world. All of it built on the banks of the Hudson River in Troy, New York. All of it gone. The women in that photograph built something that lasted over a century. Their names are mostly unknown. Their faces survive in a few collections. Their work, the precise stitching of the collars that defined American men's fashion for decades, wears away with every washing and is eventually discarded. This is what gets lost when a factory closes. Not just the jobs, not just the payroll, the knowledge, the skill, the tradition of craft passed from mother to daughter across generations, the community built around the work, the identity of a city that named itself after a product its workers made. The Arrow brand is still alive technically. The Collar City is still called that technically. But the collar is gone, and the city that made it is looking for something else to be. If your family worked in the collar factories or the shirt mills in Troy, if your grandmother's hands were scarred from a laundry furnace or a sewing machine needle, leave a comment. These stories are disappearing faster than the buildings. We need to hear them before they're gone. If this story made you think differently about what we've lost, hit like and subscribe to Traces Forgotten. There are more stories like this one. The factories are quiet. The names are still on the buildings. The people who built them are almost gone.